Picture an old man's arm. Not a wasted thing, not a stick of bone wrapped in loose skin, real muscle still there under the surface, enough that you could take hold of it and get a good handful. It looks like an arm that works. Now put a jar of pickles in that hand, one of those stubborn lids that squeaks and grabs. Ask the arm to open it, and the arm cannot. The meat is present. The force is gone. The same man, watch him try to stand up out of a low, soft chair. He rocks forward, he plants both hands on the armrests, and he pushes with his arms, because the legs will not do the job alone anymore. The legs are still there. Look at them. They fill out the trousers. But somewhere between the tissue you can see and the push you need, something has quietly walked off the premises. Here is the thing nobody at the gym, nobody at the doctor's office ever quite explains to you. After the age of 70, the actual physical stuff of a muscle, the mass of it, the tissue you could weigh on a scale, disappears at about 0.5% to 1% a year. That is slow. That is almost nothing. If your savings shrank at that rate, you would barely notice from 1 year to the next. Around age 75, it runs a little under 0.2% a year in women, and up around 0.8%, creeping toward 1% in men. Slow, a trickle. But the strength that muscle can produce, the force it can throw against a jar lid or a chair or a flight of stairs, that falls at something like 3 to 4% a year in men and 2.5 to 3% a year in women. Stop and put those two numbers next to each other, because they do not fit. The tissue leaves at 0.5% to 1% a year. The strength leaves 2, 3, 4, 5 times faster. The same muscle, the same year, the same man, and the strength is draining out of him several times quicker than the substance is. That is a mismatch, and a mismatch is a clue. If a bridge quietly lost 1% of its steel every year, you would expect it to lose about 1% of its ability to hold up a loaded truck. You would not expect it to lose 4%. If it did, you would not shrug and say, well, old bridge. You would send an engineer out there in a hard hat, because that bridge is failing in some way that is not just rust. Something besides simple shrinkage is going wrong. And I will tell you right now, we are not going to solve this by staring at the muscle. The muscle is the scene of the crime. The culprit, I suspect, is somewhere else entirely. So let us do what any decent investigator does. Let us stop trusting the obvious story and start counting things. Count the mass. By the time a person reaches 80, on average they have lost about 30% of the muscle they carried as a young adult. 30%. And the condition we call sarcopenia, which is just the doctor's word for muscle that has wasted and weakened past a certain line, that affects roughly 30% of people over 60 and up toward 1/2 of everybody past 80. So this is not some rare misfortune that strikes the unlucky few. This is the ordinary road. This is where the machinery of nearly all of us is headed unless something intervenes. That alone should make you want the real explanation, not the bumper sticker version about getting old and slowing down. Now here is where the case gets stranger, because I have been telling you about strength, but strength is not even the fastest thing to go. There is something called power. Power is not just how hard you can push. Power is how hard you can push multiplied by how fast you can do it. Force times velocity. It is the difference between slowly leaning your weight against a heavy door and shoving it open in a hurry. It is the thing you need to catch yourself when you trip, to snatch your foot forward before you hit the ground. And power, that combination of force and speed, collapses with age faster than plain strength does. Faster than strength, which is already falling faster than mass. So we have 3 quantities, and they are peeling away from each other in a very particular order. Mass goes slowest, strength goes faster. Power goes fastest of all. The quickness dies before the bulk does. Whatever is happening in that arm, it is not attacking the muscle evenly like rust spreading over a whole iron gate. It is going after the fast, snappy, explosive part of the muscle first and leaving the slow, patient part comparatively alone. That is a fingerprint. A thief who only takes the silver and ignores the copper is telling you something about what he is after. We are lucky, because somebody actually went and counted the fibers. Back in 1988, a scientist named Jan Lexel did something not many people have the stomach for. He took whole thigh muscles, the big one on the front of the thigh, the vastus lateralis, from men ranging in age from 15 years old all the way to 83, and he counted the muscle fibers. Not estimated. Counted across the whole cross section. And what he found is a small horror story told in arithmetic. Between the second decade of life and the ninth, the total number of muscle fibers roughly cut in half. Half of them simply gone. The cross-section of the thigh, the sheer area of muscle when you slice across it, shrank by something like 25 to 40% over a lifetime. But here is the detail that makes the physicist in me sit up. The muscle fibers do not all come in one flavor. There are the slow fibers, call them the endurance type, the ones that keep you standing and walking all day without complaint. And there are the fast fibers, the type 2 fibers, the ones that give you the sudden burst, the sprint, the catch, the shove. Lexel found that the slow fibers held their size pretty well across the whole span of life. They stayed roughly the size they always were. It was the fast fibers, the powerful ones, that shrank and vanished preferentially. The body was losing its sprinters and keeping its plotters. Do you feel how neatly that fits the fingerprint? Power dies first. Power lives in the fast fibers. The fast fibers are exactly the ones disappearing. It is almost too tidy. And when a case looks too tidy, when the first suspect walks right up and confesses, that is precisely the moment a good investigator gets suspicious. Because here is the trouble. Losing fibers, even losing your fast fibers first, can explain a lot. It can explain why the muscle gets smaller. It can explain why power skews away faster than bulk. But it cannot by itself explain the full size of the gap. Go back to those numbers, because the numbers are stubborn and the numbers do not care about a tidy story. If you lose half your fibers across 60 or 70 years, that is a big loss. But spread over a lifetime, it is a gentle slope. And the cross-section, the actual muscle you can see, only fell by a quarter to maybe 40%. Yet the strength, past 70, is dropping 3 or 4% every single year. The tissue loss is a slow slide. The strength loss is a cliff. If fewer fibers were the whole answer, the strength should track the tissue much more closely than it does. It should behave itself. It does not. There is a big chunk of strength and power vanishing that is simply not accounted for by counting fibers and measuring how fat the muscle is. So the first suspect, the obvious one, the one everybody assumes is guilty, that you are just losing muscle and that is that, this suspect is not innocent. Fibers really are disappearing. The fast ones really do go first. That is genuinely part of the story. But this suspect has an alibi for the biggest part of the crime. He cannot have done all of it. There is too much missing force, too much lost quickness that his confession does not cover. And when your best suspect can only account for part of the damage, you do not close the file and go home. You start asking who else was in the building, which means I want you to stop looking at the muscle as a lump of meat that is simply melting away. That picture is comforting in its dull way, and it is wrong. And it is wrong in a manner that matters enormously. Because a lump of meat melting away is a hopeless thing and there is nothing you can do about it. So set it aside. Instead, I want you to think about the muscle as a machine that is plugged into something. A machine that has to be told what to do and wired to receive the message and fed the fuel to carry it out. A muscle does not fire itself. It sits there, obediently, waiting for a signal to come down a wire from the spinal cord. No signal, no contraction, no matter how much healthy meat is sitting there ready to work. And that is the direction I think we have to go. Not deeper into the muscle. Backward, up the wire, toward the place the orders come from. Because I have a growing suspicion that a good deal of what looks like dying muscle is not the muscle dying at all. It is the muscle losing touch with the thing that commands it. So let us climb the wire together and see what we find at the top. Down in the spinal cord there are cells called motor neurons. Think of each one as a foreman standing at the end of a telephone line, and the far end of that line branches out and grabs hold of a bundle of muscle fibers. One foreman, one bundle. Together they make what we call a motor unit. When the foreman shouts, every fiber in his bundle pulls at once. That is the whole arrangement. And here is the first ugly thing the electrician finds when he goes poking around in an older body. The foremen are dying off. If you count how many working motor units a young man has running his thigh, and then you count how many an old man has, the old man is down by roughly 30%. A third of the foremen, gone. And this is not something that waits politely for you to turn 70. This wiring loss gets going earlier, quietly, and it is one of the things dragging the muscle down, not a side effect of it. Now stop and feel how strange that is. We went looking for the crime inside the meat, and the trail led us out of the meat entirely, up a wire into the nervous system. The muscle is partly a victim here, not the culprit. It is sitting there perfectly willing to work, and nobody is calling it anymore. But the body is not stupid, and it does not just leave those abandoned fibers lying there. When a foreman dies, his bundle of muscle fibers is suddenly orphaned. No wire, no signal, no orders, and a fiber that never gets a signal will wither and vanish for good. So the body performs a rescue. A neighboring foreman, one who is still alive, sends out little sprouts from his own telephone line. These sprouts creep over and grab the orphaned fibers and adopt them. Now that surviving foreman is no longer running his original small bundle, he is running his own crew plus the refugees from the crew next door. The fibers are saved. The signal reaches them again. They stay alive and they keep pulling. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, because when you first hear it, it sounds like wonderful news. It sounds like the body has solved its own problem. A foreman dies, the neighbor picks up the slack, nobody gets laid off, the muscle carries on. If you only measured the total amount of meat, you might not even notice anything had gone wrong for years. The rescue hides the damage. The books look balanced. This, I think, is exactly why the loss can creep up on a person so silently. The scale in the bathroom does not show it. The arm in the mirror does not show it. Underneath, the whole management structure is being quietly consolidated, and on the surface everything looks calm. But let us be honest bookkeepers and ask what this rescue actually costs. Before, you had many foremen, each running a small crew. That is a fine arrangement if you want delicate control, because you can call up just a few workers at a time gently and add more only as you need them. It is like having a dimmer switch on a light. You can go from a whisper of force to a little more smoothly. Now, after all the consolidation, you have fewer foremen, and each one is running an enormous crew. When one of those foremen shouts, a huge block of fibers fires all at once. You have traded your dimmer switch for a row of clumsy big levers. You want a small, careful pull, and instead you get a lurch. The muscle still has force in it, but the fine control, the smoothness, the ability to make tiny adjustments, that is leaking away. This is why an older hand can tremble threading a needle, or overshoot when reaching for a cup. Fewer, bigger, coarser motor units are running the show. So now we have two suspects standing in the room. Fewer fibers, and fewer, clumsier foremen running the fibers that remain. And you would think, all right, between the two of them we have solved it. The mystery is closed, but it is not closed, and here is the thing that turns the whole case on its head. Because if losing foremen were the whole story, then every old person would be sarcopenic to roughly the same degree, and they simply are not. You have two men of the very same age. Both have lost about the same number of motor neurons. The wiring loss is nearly identical in the two of them. Yet one of them is strong and steady and gets out of his chair like a man of 50, and the other is frail and weak and cannot rise without hauling himself up on his arms. Same nerve loss. Wildly different outcomes. So the death of the foreman, by itself, cannot be the thing that decides who becomes frail. Something else is separating these two men, and when the researchers went in and looked carefully at the thigh muscle to find what it was, they found something I think is genuinely beautiful, in the way that a clean answer to a hard question is beautiful. It was not who lost the foreman. Both men lost them. It was what the surviving foreman did about it. In the strong man, the surviving foreman sprouted vigorously, reached out, adopted the orphan fibers, and expanded their crews to cover the loss. The rescue worked. In the frail man, the survivors failed to expand. They did not send out enough sprouts. They did not pick up the slack. And so the orphan fibers, with nobody to call them, simply died and disappeared for good. That is the line between the two men, not the dying, the failure to rescue. It is not how many foremen you lose. It is whether the ones still standing are willing and able to take on the extra work. That, and not the raw loss of nerve cells, is what actually marks out the man who is sinking into frailty from the man of the same age who is holding steady. Feel what that does to the whole picture. It moves the decisive event from something that sounds like pure decay, cells dying, to something that sounds like a job half done. The compensation stalling. And a job that is stalling is a very different kind of thing from a lump of meat melting away, because a stalled process is one you might be able to push. Hold on to that thought, because we are going to come back and lean on it hard. But before we do, I have to be fair, and I have to bring in one more character, because the wiring is not the only thing changing. Let us go all the way down now, past the fibers, past the nerves, right down into the fiber itself, to the engine room. Every one of those fibers is packed with tiny power plants called mitochondria, and their whole job is to make the fuel, a molecule called ATP, that muscle burns to produce force. And when you look across people from the youngest to the oldest, you find that the machinery for making that fuel runs down with age. There is less of the mitochondrial blueprint, there is less of the working copy the cell reads from, and the actual capacity to produce ATP falls off measurably. And the people whose fuel output had dropped the most were also the ones with the poorest stamina and the poorest handling of sugar in the blood. Less fuel, in a very literal sense, being made in the engine room. And why does the fuel matter so much? Let me take you down one final step, to the smallest engine in the whole story, because this is where the physics gets gorgeous. When a muscle pulls, it pulls because trillions of tiny molecular hands, called myosin heads, reach out, grab a rope, and give it a yank. Each little hand cocks itself, latches on, and snaps through a stroke of only about 3 nanometers, 3/100000th of a meter. And the force one of these hands makes at its peak is only about 6 peckinewtons, which is a force so faint you could never feel a single one of them in 1,000 lifetimes. But now multiply that absurd little tug by the countless hands heaving together in one muscle, and it adds up to the force that lets you carry a child up a flight of stairs. That is the trick of muscle. Enormous strength assembled out of numberless, unimaginably tiny pulls. And here is the part that binds it all together. Each of those little hands cannot make its stroke for free. It has to be primed first, and it is primed by burning 1 unit of that fuel, 1 molecule of ATP. No fuel, no priming. No priming, no grab, no stroke, no force. So when the engine room upstairs starts making less fuel, you are starving the smallest engines of the very thing they need to fire. The chemistry and the mechanics are not 2 separate stories. They are one story. Long ago, a physiologist named A.V. Hill worked out the exact relationship between how hard a muscle pulls and how fast it can shorten, and he showed that the same single constant that governs the mechanics also governs the heat the muscle gives off as it burns its fuel. The pulling and the burning are locked together by one number. He won a Nobel Prize for tying those 2 things into one knot, and here in an aging muscle we are watching that knot slowly loosen, the fuel supply and the force production sagging together. And there is one last wrinkle in the engine room I have to give you, because it turns out even the repair crews get stubborn with age. When you eat protein, the building blocks called amino acids are supposed to arrive at the muscle and shout a signal that says, build, make new tissue, repair yourselves. In a young muscle, a modest shout gets a big answer. In an old muscle, the same shout gets a shrug. The muscle has gone a little deaf to the message. It still can build. It simply needs a much louder signal before it bothers to answer. And that stubbornness has a name, and it is going to matter enormously when we finally ask the question this whole investigation has been circling toward, which is the only question that really counts. Not why is this happening, but whether, once it has started, there is a single thing on this earth you can do to push back. So let me take you somewhere unlikely. A nursing home. The residents there are frail, the kind of frail where somebody worries whether you can cross a room without a hand under your elbow. The average age in one of these groups was around 90 years old. Now, if my whole gloomy story so far were the last word, if muscle was simply a record of the years, a candle burning down, then these are the people for whom the case is closed. Finished. Nothing to be done. You would not, in your right mind, hand a 90-year-old a barbell and expect the calendar to reverse. But that is exactly what Maria Fiataroni and her colleagues did, and I want you to sit with what happened, because it broke the story wide open. 10 of these volunteers, averaging 90 years, went through 8 weeks of honest, high-intensity strength training. Not waving little colored weights around, real load, real effort, the muscle asked to work near what it could manage. 8 weeks, and their strength went up on average by about 174%. Let me say that number again slowly so it does not slide past you. Their strength did not creep up a polite 5 or 10%, it nearly tripled. In the 10th decade of life. The tissue everyone had written off as a closed account turned out to be wide awake and waiting for someone to knock, and this was not a fluke of 10 lucky people. A few years later, the same line of work went bigger. 100 frail nursing home residents, average age around 87, sorted out so you could see what actually did the job. 10 weeks of resistance training. The muscle in the middle of the thigh, measured honestly by its cross-sectional area, grew by about 9%. The meat came back, and here is the part that matters for a human being trying to get out of a chair. Their walking, measured heel to toe, the wobbly tightrope test of whether your legs will betray you, improved by about 48%. Nearly half again as steady. And the ones who only got a nutrition drink and no training, they did not get those gains. It was the work that did it. The load. The signal. Now think back to everything we uncovered, because this is where the whole investigation clicks shut. We found the fast twitch fibers vanishing first. We found motor units dying and the survivors failing to reach out and adopt the orphans. We found the little power plants, the mitochondria, running down, making less fuel for the engine. We found the old muscle gone deaf to the amino acid signal, the anabolic stubbornness. Every single one of those, it turns out, is a door you can push on. The mitochondrial slump, the fuel shortage in the engine room, both aerobic work and resistance work have been shown to reverse the age-related decline in the muscle's energy machinery, its capacity to rebuild the very molecule called NAD that keeps the power plants humming. That downhill slide is not carved in stone. It is a setting, and exercise turns the dial back up. And the deafness, the anabolic resistance, the shrug you get when amino acids show up, you do not have to accept the shrug. You shout louder. This is where the protein comes in, and I want to be precise, because precision is the whole point. A young adult gets along on roughly 0.8 of a gram of protein for every kilogram of body weight each day. But the careful people who studied aging muscle, a group that put out what they called the Protage recommendations, concluded that an older adult needs more. Something like 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram every day, and more still, up toward 1.5 when illness is grinding them down. And it is not just the daily total. Because of that deafness, you have to hit the muscle with a big enough dose in one sitting to get its attention. Roughly 25 to 30 grams of protein in a meal, enough to clear the higher threshold, enough to make the stubborn old muscle finally answer, all right, I heard you, I will build. And the load itself, the training, is not mystical either. The people who study this for a living will tell you something almost boringly doable. A couple of sets, 2 or 3, of a small handful of exercises for each of the big muscle groups. Not featherweight, not crushing. Something in the range where 5 to 8 honest repetitions is genuinely hard. 2 or 3 days a week, and then, slowly, you make it a little harder as you get stronger, because the muscle only answers a signal that keeps asking something of it. That is the entire prescription. It fits on the back of an envelope. And it works on people who were supposed to be beyond working on. So let us go all the way back to the person I started with, the one whose arm looked almost unchanged, but who could no longer twist the lid off a stubborn jar, who had to shove off the armrest to stand. We thought, at the start, that we were looking at simple disappearance. Muscle melting away quietly, the way ice goes off a pond. And we were wrong about the character of the thing. What we were really watching was not a substance vanishing. It was a conversation breaking down. The nerves not calling as clearly, the survivors not reaching out to cover for the fallen, the engines running low on fuel, the repair crews pretending not to hear the order. A whole chain of small refusals, each one polite, each one gradual, adding up to a jar lid that will not turn. And every refusal in that chain, it turns out, can be answered. Not with a drug we are still hunting for, not with a machine we have not built. With load and with the raw material to rebuild, delivered loudly enough that even a stubborn old muscle cannot ignore it. The nerve sprouts. The surviving motor units, given a reason, expand and take up the slack. The power plants come back online. The engine, that beautiful little machine where a myosin head hauls itself along a filament a few billionths of a meter at a time, pulling with a force you would need 1,000,000,000,000 of just to lift a feather, that engine starts firing in ranks again. Here is the thing I most want to leave you holding. All through this talk I kept calling it a mystery, a case, a thing gone wrong. But the deepest surprise is not in any single clue. It is in what the clues, laid side by side, finally say about the nature of the tissue itself. Your muscle is not a monument to the years you have already spent. It is not a ledger being closed. Right now, tonight, in a 90-year-old and in you, it is asking a question and waiting for an answer. Do we still need to be strong? And it will believe whatever you tell it. Tell it nothing, and it takes the silence for a no, and it lets the fast fibers go, and it lets the wiring thin, and it quietly powers down. Tell it yes, with real work and real fuel, and it will start rebuilding an engine you thought had left the station for good. That is the astonishing thing hiding inside a jar that will not open, not that the body runs down. But that, cell by cell, cross bridge by cross bridge, right up to the very end, it is still listening for you to answer.